Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our program, 21st Century Labor Policies to Promote Worker Freedom, Opportunity, and Entrepreneurship. Please welcome Rachel Gressler, Senior Research Fellow in the Heritage Foundation's Grover M. Herman Center for the Federal Budget.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming today and for joining us for today's event, 21st Century Labor Policies to Promote Worker Freedom, Opportunity, and Entrepreneurship. My name is Rachel Gressler, and I'm a Senior Research Fellow here at the Heritage Foundation. Work is the meaning of what this country is all about. We need it as individuals, we need to sense it in our fellow citizens, and we need it as a society and as a people. Bill Clinton was quoting Robert Kennedy when he spoke those words as he signed the Welfare Reform Act of 1996. Now, of course, those words are as true today as they were when Clinton spoke them in 96 and when Kennedy said them nearly 30 years prior. At its core, work is how we survive. It's how families put food on the table and roofs over their heads, but work is more than just that. Beyond the income it provides, work offers dignity, a sense of accomplishment, a feeling of contribution to society that are fundamental to human happiness. And it's through work, whether that is in an office, at home, in a lab, or on a farm, that we channel our innate creativity and ingenuity to develop life-saving medical treatments, time-saving technological innovations, and cost-saving production methods that enrich our lives with more than just food on our table. And speaking of food on our table, last week, my family's second refrigerator died. Now, while this was just a modest inconvenience, it did make me think of the ways that technology and innovation in the way that we work have made our lives so much easier. So it was about a century ago that the first household refrigerator came to the market. It was roughly the equivalent of a college dorm room fridge, and it cost a small fortune. Last week, I ordered one online that is about 5 times as large, costs a fraction of the price, and was delivered to me within a few days. And in the interim, my kids were not deprived of their normal 10 gallons a week of milk that they consume, thanks to the affordable option of app-based delivery services of groceries, so that I could order milk daily instead of having to go to the grocery store. Growth in flexible work options in remote offices and in the technology that support those have allowed more people to be their own bosses and to be able to work when, where, and how they want. That's meant more parents can balance work and family life more effectively. Individuals with disabilities can find work options that accommodate their unique needs, and it's meant that students can help support their education. Consumers benefit too. An individual told me about how he delivers for Shipt, and often his deliveries are going to Section 8 housing to families that don't own a car, can't get to the grocery store, and he's bringing them diapers and food. But even beyond the independent work growth, we've seen big increases in workplace flexibility and family-friendly policies in traditional workplaces. And that includes a 77% increase in access to paid family leave benefits over just the last 5 years. But despite all of these advancements that could help more Americans pursue meaningful work, we face challenges. Millions of people remain on the sidelines, making it harder for employers to find the workers they need. And the government's spending-induced inflation has left the average worker's paycheck worth $2,500 less than it was in 2021. And this is all before a slew of new regulations take effect, limiting how people can work, upending small business models, taking away workplace flexibility, and penalizing workers who don't want to belong to a union. I think most Americans can agree that we would like labor policies that support maximum labor force participation, ample work opportunities, rising incomes, and flexibility. At the Heritage Foundation, we believe that requires putting personal choices and the freedom to seek opportunities first. Unfortunately, the current administration and some proposals in Congress would put the interests of politicians, bureaucrats, and big labor bosses ahead of ordinary workers and small businesses. Moreover, there's been an attempt by some right-of-center thinkers to convince conservatives that centuries-old free market principles have failed, that laws of basic economics no longer apply, and that government intervention in the labor market could be a means to fix social ills. But aside from fundamental labor protections that have been the law of the land now for 60 years, added government intervention primarily just picks winners and losers. It props up some people and it boxes out others. And besides that inherent unfairness, government has a pretty terrible track record in picking winners and losers. And it's American taxpayers, workers, and consumers who end up paying the price when government subsidizes losing ventures and squashes winning prospects. So today, I'm excited for you to hear from 3 panels. Our first is going to explore what basic economic principles and government intervention mean for job creators, for the workers that they employ, and for the customers that they serve. Our second panel features independent workers and small business owners who will talk about how government mandates and interventions impede flexibility and upward mobility in the workplace. And we'll wrap up our event with a panel discussing the historical role of unions and hearing the untold stories of some workers who have experienced the consequences of unions putting their own interests ahead of the workers they represent. So I'd like you to join me in welcoming to stage our first panel here. We have my colleague, David Burton, who is a senior fellow in economic policy at the Heritage Foundation. Prior to joining us, David was previously the general counsel at the National Small Business Association, as well as the New England Machinery Company, and he spent decades representing small businesses. Todd McCracken is the president and CEO of the National Small Business Association. And Ben Brubeck is the vice president of regulatory, labor, and state affairs at the Associated Builders and Contractors. We're going to get started here. We're going to have a discussion, but to kick it off, I'd like to ask each of our panelists to give about 5 minutes of opening remarks, starting with David here, who's going to talk about just the basics of employment law and how the economics apply to that.
Yeah, I wanted to just take a minute and talk about the economics of the labor and employment market and how it works, because I think people are beginning to lose sight of that. Start with the basic choices that an employee or employer face, and wages are not arbitrary. They're determined like other prices in a competitive market. So an employer doesn't just pick a number out of the air. They basically pay what they have to pay to get workers, right? But the maximum amount that they can pay is what the expected output of that worker is going to be. If they pay more than the worker's output or produce, then they'll go broke. If they pay less than the market, then they'll lose their employees to other employers who can then profit by hiring those employees away, because the employees will produce more than the artificially low wage. So these markets are highly competitive and determined by supply and demand. Demand is basically a function of the productivity or output of the worker. And this is important to understand, that these things aren't arbitrary. That leads to sort of the next step. If you mandate benefits or impose a tax, the vast majority of that is going to come at the expense of the employee's wages. In labor or employment supply is relatively inelastic. People in their prime working years need to work, and they can't easily move. Capital, on the other hand, is highly mobile and can go anywhere on the planet. So the vast, in a way an economist would say that is, labor supply is relatively inelastic, and then capital is highly mobile or elastic. But what that means is that when the government imposes a payroll tax, the vast majority of the payroll tax is borne by employees. And if the government imposes a mandate that you have to provide a particular benefit, say health insurance, that's borne by the employees in the form of lower wages. If the government says you have to pay, say, paid family leave, that's going to be borne by employees in the form of lower wages. And one of the reasons that cash wages have not grown as much as we would like is that the cost of healthcare in this country is extraordinarily expensive. In fact, our healthcare system costs twice the OECD average in terms as a percentage of GDP. Another thing I'd like to mention is it doesn't matter whether it's an employer mandate or an employee mandate, it still comes primarily at the expense of the employees. This is something they teach in sort of the first couple weeks of microeconomics or price theory. If you impose the employer payroll tax, say in FICA, is borne by employees just like the employee tax is. It's just hidden. So when you impose these mandates on employers, it really comes primarily at the expense of employee wages. I wanted to mention a couple other things. Yes, mandates are basically a tax. They're analogous to a tax, and they have what economists would call deadweight loss or an excess burden. In other words, they reduce output. And in a labor market, that means they cost employment and reduce the amount of employment, the amount of jobs. I guess two other things that I might mention. One is that is a little different, but it applies to all regulations, but we're seeing that very much now, is that regulatory costs do not increase linearly with size. In other words, if the government imposes a new regulation on businesses, a business that's 10 times as big as another business does not have regulatory costs that are 10 times as high. So a small business is has a negative competitive effect. Their cost as a percentage of revenues and therefore as a percentage of the price of the goods and services that they're selling is disproportionately high. And you see that throughout our economy now, but you probably have heard stories or seen data that indicate in the highly regulated industries like banking and finance, communications, energy, healthcare, small firms are disappearing at a very rapid rate, and we have an increasing concentration. And that's largely a function of the ever-increasing regulatory burden on businesses in this country, and it's one of the reasons that small businesses are suffering so much and that the big companies are becoming dominant. In the areas where I work the most, for example, we're losing 200 to 300 broker-dealers a year, which means over a period of a decade, we've lost about a third. And those are the people that serve small businesses and entrepreneurs seeking to raise capital. In banking, the top 10 banks now control over half the deposits in a world where we nominally have 6,000 banks. In healthcare, small, doctors are routinely closing their practices and going to work for hospitals because they can't bear the regulatory costs and still earn a living. So then the same is true in labor and employment. As we make it more and more difficult to hire people and comply with the vast array of regulations imposed by the Department of Labor, the NLRB, and the EEOC and others, it becomes more and more costly to employ people, and that has a disproportionate adverse effect on small firms.
Yep, and that's a perfect lead up now for Todd giving us kind of a current state of the environment for small businesses.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's great to be here today. Thanks to Heritage for producing this event. It's really very timely, as you say. The small business world is dramatically impacted by forces on the employment front for all the reasons David just mentioned. Right, the fixed costs of these mandates on small companies are enormous and a huge share of their overall compensation burden. I mean, to put a example of what David was talking about, if an employee can produce as profitable, let's say a $50,000 level of compensation, but the company is required to provide $30,000 in overall benefits, they can really only afford to give a $20,000 cash compensation to that employee. If a larger company, if those same benefits only cost them $15,000, they can pay that person a lot more money, and they're both making the same amount of money on that employee. So what that winds up happening in the small business marketplace, think about what you would do if you were a small business owner. You would perhaps try to look for employees that don't need those benefits or that don't want those benefits, so that you can actually pay them more cash money so that you can be competitive in the marketplace. And so these rules create weird distortions in the small business marketplace for employees. The other thing we have to remember is that small companies typically, until they're probably 20 employees or more, don't really have a dedicated HR function. So all these requirements for folks to comply with regulations, to think about how what their compensation levels are, keep track of all the types of leave they may have to be required to provide, falls on the business owner. So they spend all the time they spend doing that, or time they're not spending mentoring employees, marketing their company, developing relationships with customers, et cetera. The things they need to do to grow their business, raising capital. So it has a huge impact on those small companies. And then finally, we have to remember that it really is true what we hear all the time, that small companies create 2/3 of the new jobs. But that's tied to the ability of those companies to start and to get going. And a lot of the burdens in the employment marketplace prevent that. And we've seen, as David alluded to, steady declines in the rate of new startups for small companies in this country for the last 50 years. It's a long-term trend. It's fluctuated up and down a little bit over the years based on various policies, but it clearly corresponds to greater regulations of all kind, but especially in the employment marketplace. So this is something that I think should concern all of us, because it prevents those companies from starting and from growing long term. While small companies produce about 2/3 of new jobs, they have about half of all private sector jobs. You might think, well, why is that discrepancy? It's because so many of those companies that start, they grow, they create all these jobs, and eventually they're not small anymore. So when you count the static jobs that are out there, many of those jobs that are created by small companies are now large companies. You count them as large company jobs, but they are only there because of the startups and the growth of the small company in the first place. And that's a really important thing to remember, and why all of this matters so much. Getting back to Rachel's question also, what's happening in the small business world right now, finding and keeping qualified workers continues to be the #1 challenge that small companies tell us about. And that obviously goes up and down over the years. Sometimes it's at the top, sometimes it's not, depending on what's happening with the economy and whether they're trying to grow or not. But right now, it is the chief challenge. And to take those small companies and to not address their chief challenge, but to make it more difficult by imposing more fixed costs on their workforce, and to making it harder for them to find and keep the right kind of employees is exactly the wrong way to go. So I'll look forward to Q&A, and we can talk more about all those things.
Thanks, Todd. And Ben, could you give us an overview of the construction industry?
Yeah, great to see you guys, and Rachel and Heritage, thank you for having me. I work for Associated Builders and Contractors, which is a construction trade association. We've got about 22,000 member contractors, subcontractors, and other businesses in the construction industry, mainly in the commercial and industrial space, so not a lot of home builders. And we have a kind of unusual situation right now in the construction industry. It's sort of a perfect storm of economic issues, demographic issues, and regulatory issues. And I know all of you guys are looking for construction projects to start as a result of the infrastructure bill and a bunch of other legislation that's passed the last couple of years. But the industry is in an interesting spot. We're very small business, concentrated industry. 82% of companies in the construction industry have less than 10 employees. 99% of the firms have less than 100 employees. That 99% performs about 2/3 of all construction, but that 1% performs a third of the construction work. So there's a heavy concentration of small businesses. And as you were mentioning earlier, there's a lot of larger companies that are doing a lot of the work. We're seeing a concentration of that. We've seen a decline, about 60% decline, a number of small business firms that have been awarded federal contracts in the last decade. So we're seeing that death of small business in a lot of the public contracting space, especially, which we'll talk about a little bit more. On the demographic side, we have a skilled labor shortage of about 500,000 people right now. And that's a result of frankly, baby boomers and other folks retiring and not replacing those workers at the same pace at the younger level. So we're recruiting from all different areas to get people into the construction industry. And we're having some success, but we continue to get people into the industry. We're also facing a material cost escalation of about 40% since the start of the pandemic. We're also experiencing higher lending costs because of the interest rates. So everything that's going on right now is creating more risk. It's increasing the cost of construction, and it's creating uncertainty for businesses to get into the public contracting marketplace, especially. And these regulatory costs, these regulatory burdens, are a tax on businesses and getting into the competitive marketplace. But they end up being a tax on consumers and taxpayers at the end of the day, because when you have less competition, you have higher costs. And we see that time and time again with bad regulatory policies that the Biden administration is pushing that really favor labor, organized labor. And in the construction industry, 12% of the construction workforce belongs to a union. So 88% are non-union. And a lot of these policies that we'll talk about today encourage or actually require the use of union labor. So we've got a skilled labor shortage on one hand. We've got the Biden administration saying that they would like to lock out 8 out of 10 construction workers. It's bad policy, and it's driving the economic costs. It's driving the death of small businesses, and it's hurting taxpayers. We're not getting as many roads, schools, bridges, and other infrastructure that we deserve from our investments in infrastructure. And so we'll talk more about that today, but that's kind of overview where we're at, and appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for highlighting how these policies play out in the real world. And so David was talking about the mandates and the regulations that increase the cost of employment can result in fewer jobs. And that's especially true if you are not in a strong labor market. But at the same time, we had a really unique situation with COVID. Everybody would assume the labor market's going to be terrible, jobs are going to be lost, wages are going to go down, and yet the opposite happened. And in large part, that was because we had government policies that simultaneously spent trillions of dollars sending massive amount of money and therefore increasing demand into the economy at the same time that there were huge unemployment insurance benefits and other incentives for workers to not work. So you're increasing the demand for workers and you're reducing the supply for workers. What happens then? You have a shortage. And so because there was so much demand, employers they were able to raise wages. The consequence of that is that we're all paying significantly higher prices today. I want to look a little bit longer term, David, and get your thoughts on this. I think if we go back to kind of the height of labor force participation 2 decades ago, we have roughly 10 million fewer workers participating in the labor force today. And so that's a problem. And I think it can lead policymakers to grasp onto ideals like, let's just mandate really high minimum wages so that more people are willing to work. Let's have free college for all so that people can become educated to have what they need to be in the workforce. Why are those not solutions that are actually going to help?
Well, in terms of minimum wages, it's a form of price control, and price controls in different markets have a long history. But if the government mandates a price that's too low, rent control would be an example, you end up getting shortages because people can't make money, they don't supply the good or service that people want. If you set the price too high, then the market shrinks because you're basically demanding that only a subset of the possible transactions occur. You're making, in the case of minimum wage, you're making it illegal for young or relatively low-skilled workers to work. And you see that whenever minimum wages are applied, but you also see it in spades in the European labor market. A big part of what the Biden administration is trying to do is Europeanize the American labor and employment market. And, it's not a mystery what that will do. You just have to look at Europe. Right? Now, the European unemployment rate is at the lowest it's been in at least a decade, right? But it's still twice as high as the U.S. unemployment rate. Right? Young people in Europe, unless their parents are politically connected, simply can't get decent work. Right? And the labor markets are extraordinarily rigid. Basically, if someone hires an employee, in fact, it's sort of like the federal civil service. If you hire somebody, you can't get rid of them, and even if they're not working. So if you do this, the results on workers are actually quite negative in terms of compensation, in terms of the amount of jobs available, in terms of opportunities. I mean, there is a reason why American workers live dramatically better than their European counterparts. And a big piece of it, there are a few others, like tax levels, but a big piece of it is the labor and employment regulations that make it very difficult to work and systematically reduce compensation paid to European workers.
Yeah, and that makes me think of Puerto Rico. They have very progressive labor policies, and their labor force participation rate is 44%. If that was what we had in the US, we'd have roughly a third fewer workers. 50 million people would just be not working. And so you have these policies that might seem great for the people who are fortunate enough to get a job in the formal labor force, but you have all these other people who just can't even get in the door, and they might be doing something under the table, but they don't have a protected job there. And on the minimum wage, I've done some research here. I guess starting out, this is a basic wage, a tiny, tiny fraction. I think it's like 0.001% of workers are full-time workers who are earning the minimum wage. It's supposed to be a stepping stone. It's the bottom rung of that ladder so that people can get their foot in the door and get the experience to get the next job up. It is not meant to be a career wage, but the problem with mandating really high minimum wages, there's now a proposal in Congress by Bernie Sanders to have a $17 per hour minimum wage. What would that do? Well, $17 per hour in Mississippi is like $39 per hour in DC. What would happen here if we had a $39 per hour minimum wage? Obviously, prices would skyrocket. There'd be fewer jobs. I mean, in Mississippi, half the people make less than $17 per hour. So you massively disrupt the markets. I just did a study to look at the impact on childcare because this is a highly regulated business. You can't just automate childcare. You can't replace those workers with robots. And so most of those costs get passed on to families in the form of higher prices for childcare. And across the US, $17 per hour would mean a 20% increase in childcare costs. But that's on average. Places like Vermont, DC, California, they'd have tiny increases because they're already high cost areas. Places like Mississippi, Louisiana, Kentucky, 40% increases. I mean, that basically decimates options for people. So I think it is important to keep those things in mind. Dave, or Ben, I wanted to talk to you about the infrastructure packages that have been passed. I mean, in total, it's roughly $1 trillion in new tax credits, spending, all these things that are going out the door to the construction industry. Most of that is subject to something called the Davis-Bacon Act. This is a 1931 law. It was originally meant to discriminate against black workers by setting the, quote, prevailing wage that had to be paid so high that it was out of reach for African Americans. That's no longer the point today, but nevertheless, it's a very discriminatory law, and it discriminates against the 88% of construction workers who don't work for a union. So there's that Davis-Bacon Act and a similar project labor agreement, and that's part of a lot of this spending. Can you tell us what the impact of that will be?
Yeah, you were talking about minimum wages. Well, we've had this unusual rule in the construction industry since the 1930s that the government actually determines the minimum wage rate, but it's not an average. It's actually a prevailing wage rate, and the Department of Labor does this bizarre survey process of contractors to figure out what is the most prevailing wage. And there's been fights over the years about how you calculate that. In fact, the Department of Labor just issued a final rule recently totally changing the regulations related to the Davis-Bacon Act, undoing about 40 years of progress that the Reagan administration made and legal victories over the years. But basically what the government says is you have to pay construction workers on federal or federally assisted construction projects a government-determined wage. And a lot of these wage rates are totally out of line of what the market pays or even what the local prevailing wage rate is. In some markets, the government hasn't surveyed an area in 40 years. And so the wage rate, the minimum wage rate has to be $8 or $9. In other markets, it's extremely expensive and it's the union rate. And it may be way above the overall marketplace. So long story short, these regulations discourage small businesses. There's a lot of regulatory uncertainty related to some of these rules, especially as they change. And it discourages a lot of competition. A lot of our contractors who do public works projects don't want to do it after that experience. There's too much red tape. They know that they can build the same exact type of project that may not get federal funding for much less, 20, 30% less, as a result of all the regulations and the additional red tape caused by Davis-Bacon. So when you drive out those small businesses, there's also another factor in all this, and that is that the wage rates are supposed to be union rates in a lot of these circumstances. When the union rates prevail, that makes unionized contractors more competitive in the marketplace. So you've got a distortion in competition caused by policy. The other issue we are facing is project labor agreements. The Biden administration is requiring project labor agreements on federal construction contracts of $35 million or more. We're waiting on the FAR Council to issue a final rule. And when you do that, you're telling contractors you have to sign a union agreement as a condition of working on the project. You have to hire all of your employees from the union hiring halls. You have to follow union work rules. You have to pay into union pension and benefit programs. The net effect of that is contractors don't want to build without their own employees. They know their safety. They know their productivity. Why would you use strangers? So they don't bid on these projects. And we have reduced competition. You have all these other union work rules on top of it. It increases the cost of construction between 18% and 20% per project. Again, that means we're getting fewer roads, schools, and bridges as a result of bad public policy. And this is all being driven because the biggest donors to the Democrat Party and the Biden administration are construction trade unions. And this is a way through cronyism and basically schemes to make sure that their donors get a lot of these contracts with little competition, and it's on the backs of taxpayers. And it's hurting small businesses. So we're very frustrated by this right now. We're trying to enact some change and let all Americans bid and work on these construction projects and drive down those prices so we get more infrastructure and our economy is more competitive over the long term.
Thank you. And I think Davis-Bacon is an example of when you have the government decides, I know what the correct wage is and I'm going to set it. I pulled some stats here on Davis-Bacon. So cement masons in Spartanburg, South Carolina, the market rate is about $20 per hour, but Davis-Bacon says that the market rate is $14 per hour. So that's what they're paid with zero benefits. So Davis-Bacon says in Spartanburg, South Carolina, cement masons get about $40,000 in compensation per year. Davis-Bacon says in Nauset, Suffolk, New York area, the same cement masons get $171,000 in compensation per year. That's well above the average. I mean, in benefits alone, $33.50. So this is in no way a prevailing wage. This is the government is picking and choosing winners and losers based on who they want to supplement. Todd, let's get more to small businesses. America loves small businesses, and I've seen surveys as we're growing increasingly distrustful of big businesses and of politicians. We still love small businesses. I think it's the notion that anybody could start a small business, but it's not an easy thing to do. So I was hoping that you can talk a little bit about the hurdles they face, and then also just the difference between big business and small business, because a lot of the regulations that are coming out, they assume that these small businesses are going to have all these resources. And so they'll put into the regulation, oh, it's going to cost you $25 to pay your compensation, benefits, and job analysis specialist to read over this rule, which, by the way, is 60 pages long. But do they even have these compensation, job specialist benefit analysis?
Yeah, obviously they don't, right? These are things, as I was saying before, that the business owner, him or herself, has to deal with. Or, and more likely if it's a rule that they have to take seriously and affects them they can't understand, they wind up hiring somebody, some outside legal expert at a pretty high expense to help them figure out what they need to do and not do in some cases. So the reality of a small business is very different than what federal policymakers seem to assume when they put these regulations in place. As I was saying before, most small companies, until they reach about 20 employees, it varies by firm obviously, but about 20 employees probably, it's when they first have their dedicated HR function, somebody whose job it is to sort through these things and deal with employees and help the business owner. Until you get to that point, it's just another thing someone has to deal with when they're trying to raise capital, trying to recruit employees, trying to find customers, trying to promote the business, trying to create a social media presence, et cetera, that people have to do to start and run a successful company. So what do you wind up with in reality, right? you impose all these series of rules and regulations, often with a high level of complexity on these small firms. They're imposed at the federal level, the state level, the local level, and it's virtually impossible, especially for a startup company, to even understand how to comply, even understand that some of these rules exist in the first place. So it's fundamentally bad policy, because we're creating a scenario where whole swaths of the small business community, especially in the smallest parts, especially in the startup sphere, are in violation of rules, because they have to be, because they don't know about them. And if they do know about them, the way they suppose they might comply with them is sometimes mistaken, because they don't understand how to comply with them. So we're creating amongst the hardest working, probably the most important part of our economy, and a part of our society that, as you said, Rachel, the American people trust the most. We're putting them in an impossible position for success, and it's an extraordinary problem. I would add, as we think about how small businesses can comply with these things, I mentioned before that the smallest companies face some of these high fixed costs for benefits. One of the ways that they are able to get the company launched in the first place and bring on that first worker or two to help them is to utilize independent contractors. That enables them to have more flexibility. It's a tried and true way of proceeding for these small companies. And it's even higher levels of using independent contractors in the smallest companies that are started by women and minorities, which is part of a huge part of our growth right now in the small business community that we need to encourage. But they're able to do that because of some relatively recent independent contractor rules that have enabled that. But there's a whole set of new proposals from the administration that would basically make that impossible. And I don't think they really understand that they're going to eliminate the ability of all of these companies to begin to grow, to add that next worker. Because if they have to add a new worker with all of the regulations that are imposed, and think about all the things they have to do to add a non-contractor helper, then they simply aren't going to grow, and it's going to have an impact on the entire economy.
Yep, that's a great point. We're going to explore that more in our next panel that's up. The average small business that has between just 0 and 4 employees uses 7 independent contractors on average. That's how they compete with the bigger companies, and it's how they grow. So that's a really important part. We have more to discuss, but we've run out of time for that. So I'd like to open it up to questions and answers. Back.
Hi, my name is Dinah Perch-Scott-Roth, and I wanted to ask the panel about the communications that seem to be taking place between the Labor Department and the Federal Trade Commission and the NLRB. So they seem to be working together now, and I was wondering if any of you had any comments on why these agencies are working together and why the FTC seems to be interfering in labor matters.
Thank you. Do you have any comments on that, David?
I haven't read it yet. So I'd hesitate to comment, but I'm sure they're up to mischief.
Yes, there's some new guidance, coordination that has recently come out. I know that one troubling component of that is that the FTC would use their heavy hand to say we will not approve mergers unless the company agrees to be neutral in terms of a union organizing campaign. And I think that you can hear some of the consequences of that if the company actually does be neutral, which means you don't get to tell your workers anything. You have to stand off to the side. Don't let them know what it might be like under a unionized environment. And we'll hear more about that on our third panel on unions. Others? Mm-hmm.
Oh, gosh. Sorry. No, thanks. I didn't. I don't hold it. I was just curious. I can't recall your name on the right side, but I was curious if your group does any. You said that there was a large shortage in workers within the construction field, and I was wondering if your group had any type of apprenticeship programs that they use to try to increase the size of the labor force and expertise within that area? And if you guys give out like, industry recognized credentials or anything of that sort?
That's a great question. So ABC, Associated Builders and Contractors, we have more than 400 registered apprenticeship programs. We say register, that means we're registered with the government, the Department of Labor or state labor agencies. And it's part of our all of the above workforce development effort. Because a lot of the industry doesn't use registered apprenticeship programs. They're small businesses. They don't see the value in going through the red tape to get an apprenticeship program set up. In fact, the apprenticeship programs only graduate about 45,000 people per year. There's about 250,000 people in those programs at any given time. So when I talk about the skilled labor shortage of 500,000 people, and there's only 45,000 people graduating from those programs, you can see how these programs aren't meeting the industry's demand. But the industry trains in a lot of different ways. They have in-house programs. They work with vocational technical schools, community workforce development boards, lots of different areas that train outside of the registered apprenticeship program. But we are seeing the Biden administration push registered apprenticeship on contracts, and federal contracts, federally assisted contracts, state and local contracts. And that's because 75% of all people in registered apprenticeship programs in the construction industry are from union programs. So this is a way, by saying, hey, we're all for workforce development, they're steering these contracts to their friends, making sure the union workers get these jobs and unionized contractors get these jobs. But we are supportive of an all of the above workforce development push, because we need to solve this in order to build our infrastructure. And it can't just be only through registered apprenticeship. And that's been our message up on Capitol Hill and in the state houses. You've got to support the entire ecosystem. It's like in the energy world. You don't just focus only on solar. You focus on solar, wind, hydrogen, all these other different options that are there. Same thing for workforce development. So those of you who think that registered apprenticeship is the only way to do it, think again, there's lots of other alternatives out there. And we hope the Biden administration gets that message.
Excuse me, sorry.
First off, thanks for being here. This has already been super informative. I'm Sam Papke. I work with Senator Lee and assist him on labor issues. Great to see you, David. We've worked together on some issues previously. I wanted to go back to the Davis-Bacon Act, and Senator Lee has actually introduced for a number of Congresses a full repeal of Davis-Bacon. But I was curious if there are specific provisions that are most harmful, or specific pieces of that calculation of the prevailing wage rate that could be, I don't know, intermediate steps to a full repeal. Are there ways for us to really get at the worst pieces of it? And that's for anyone, but probably most relevant
Yeah,
here.
I'll take it. So one of the things we called for in the proposed rule that the Department of Labor issued was, why are they doing these archaic surveys? Why are they reaching out to companies with paper and asking for their responses? These aren't even federal contractors. These are private contractors. Why would they spend the time responding to a survey? We said the Bureau of Labor Statistics actually has incredible data that they can use to set the prevailing wage. They wouldn't have to wait for a 4 or 5 year survey process from beginning to start to end, and they can get actual local market rate. So we suggested that. Department of Labor said, no, that's actually not the definition of prevailing. It's going to be the modal rate. It's the most frequent wage rate in the response to the surveys. You know why they want it that way? Because union collective bargaining agreements all pay the same exact wage. And if the exact same wage appears in the survey responses more than 50% of the time under the old rule, now they've changed to 30% of the time, that becomes the union wage rate. So when the union wage rate is adopted, that means that not only do you have to pay the union wage rate, but you have to follow the union collective bargaining agreement rules. The union collective bargaining agreements aren't published anywhere. So that really becomes complicated for contractors who don't know whether they should pay this person as a drywaller or another trade, depending on what the union collective bargaining agreement means. Small businesses are in this sort of regulatory cloak and dagger world, which increases their costs as a result of this. So providing regulatory clarity on the work rule, using BLS to set the wage rates, I think that'll change things dramatically for a lot of contractors.
Or just, you could just simply say that the prevailing wage is the average rate for a given occupation as determined by BLS, period, full stop. That would be progress. Not ideal by, obviously, but progress.
Thanks, guys, for being here today. I appreciate your fighting behalf on the underdogs. The small businesses and entrepreneurs definitely make up the bulk of the economic fabric in America, yet representation in DC is severely disproportionate. My question is kind of theoretical. You spoke to the kind of death cycle we see ourselves in, where the big businesses that can afford the big lobbying firms and build PACs and huge PR campaigns that really favor larger and more complex federal regulations that favor big businesses. How do we break out of that cycle where it's kind of a money wrapped in politics, pay to play scheme, from my perspective, that severely favors big businesses and kind of crushes the small businesses? And how can we build a more competitive system that gets rid of crony capitalism? It's okay to say I don't know.
Well, I'll take a stab at it. That's a much bigger political question, of course, than the workplace rules we're talking about today. But it is a long-term issue because the voice of small businesses aren't heard as loudly, I think, as other larger companies, and it is a disproportionate fight, I guess, in a way. Not that we're fighting bigger businesses, but yeah, they are impacted differently by some of these rules than smaller companies are. That's just the reality. And so you don't hear the same level of concern from them on some of these things as you might hear from a small business. Also, you have to remember the people who are most affected by all these policies are the businesses that haven't even started yet and might not be able to start as a result. There's no voice for someone who's thinking about starting a business, right? Who's just fundraising for starting to start a business. There's no organized representation of that people or of those people in this town. So really, we just have to rely on what we talked about before, and that is the fact that in reality, they may disagree on how, but most of our politicians of all political stripes desire to help small companies grow and succeed. They have different ideas about how to do that. Some of them are right, some of them are not. But the fact that small companies are so trusted and so valued in this country across the political spectrum is something we have to, make play in our favor and point out these errors when politicians make them. It's not a perfect solution, but we've got to, perhaps fix the whole political system to really get at what you're talking about. And I don't know how to do that.
I would briefly say the following: the ever increasing role of the administrative state in regulating our economy hurts small businesses, helps large firms, and also induces them to engage politically with lobbyists and political giving so they can warp the administrative state to their benefit. Right? The same is true with the ever increasing legislation. I mean, these multi-thousand page bills they keep passing, right? And conservatives should not give in to that siren song of increased federal regulation or increased federal legislation to achieve allegedly conservative ends, because it ultimately plays to the benefit of the largest corporations and crushes small businesses and also hurts the American people.
Yeah, I would just add, reining in the regulatory state. Congress can't pass legislation. Executive actions get passed in order to pass the president's agenda. And then you've got out of control regulations that have a real cost on taxpayers and small businesses. The Davis-Bacon regulation I was reading earlier, mentioned earlier, it's 800 pages long. The government thought that it would take a company just 4 hours to understand the entire regulation and implement it across its country. They figured it was four hours times $50 an hour. It's a $200 cost to a company to just understand the regulation. Totally out to lunch, totally out of touch. And we're not even talking about the added costs on top of the policy that's being created by the policy there. So the regulators have to get out of the way of progress and growth and let small businesses flourish.
And I think we have time for one more question.
Oh, sorry. Good morning, Heritage family. I thank you for this panel. Statement: is the solution always political? I've lived long enough to see policy change from left to right, right to left, left to right. And here we are with this country in a decline. Can we use some out-of-the-box scenarios? Is it possible that we can use quantum science to do an end around of the collusion between big corporations and big business. Not a political solution, an out-of-the-box quantum solution. And that will require us to sit down with entities and persons like a Peter Thiel to address these issues and see if we can create an out-of-the-box solution. Thank you.
Let me say two things in response to that. First, at the Heritage Foundation and among conservatism properly understood, we hope to make politics increasingly unimportant and allow civil society, small businesses, the business community at large, able to promote human flourishing and well-being without government. But I have, I guess, a word of skepticism. You may not be interested in politics, but politics is interested in you, right? The bottom line is the administrative state will come for you and if you don't comply. And it's not something you can get around. We need to reduce the role of government in our lives.
Thank you. And with that, we're going to conclude our first panel and invite our second panel on stage here. And Patrice Onwuko is going to moderate that panel. Patrice is the director of the Center for Economic Opportunity at the Independent Women's Forum. Welcome.
Wonderful. Okay, everybody all settled?
Yep.
Awesome. All right, well, it's an honor to be here to represent and talk with small business owners, independent contractors, and really bring to life what we heard in the first panel, which is an run-amok regulatory state has implications on people who are just trying to carve out their American dream. People who are just trying to earn a living, raise families, build something for someone else, leave a legacy for someone else, like their families, or create opportunities for people who would have no opportunities. And so the title of this session is Why Protecting Independence is Vital for Opportunities and Flexibility. And on our panel today, we've got several people who are going to speak to those different issues and give some color, some flesh, put some flesh on the bones of what we heard in the previous panel. But I just got to, one of the things we're going to really focus on also is reclassification of independent contractors and why it is so detrimental to see the onslaught of aggression, frankly, towards this community of 65 million people who are freelancing in some way, and the kind of the costs that are attached. So how we'll do this today, I'm going to give each of the panelists a few minutes to talk about themselves, to share their story, and to share a little bit about how the regulatory state is having an impact on them. I've got some prepared questions for each of them, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. We'll leave plenty of time for you guys to ask questions, and I think their experiences are going to provide plenty of fodder for you to be thinking about. Okay, so we're going to go in this order. We have Karen Anderson. She's the founder of Freelancers Against AB5. If you have not heard of AB5, it is California trying to, the United States trying to Californianize the rest of the country with bad labor policy. So she will speak to it from the Facebook group that she founded, which has, what, over 30,000, is it, or 40,000?
Almost 19,000.
Almost 19,000 thousands of Californians alone who've been affected by this policy. Next to her is Carrie Lucas. She's the president of Independent Women's Forum. She's my boss. But she will speak to, as a small business owner, as running an organization of purely all women located around the world, frankly, what it means when these regulations hit in small companies. And then on the end, we've got Clement Troutman, founder of the Troutman Alliance, LLC, and owner of Tropical Smoothie Cafe. For those of you guys get your smoothies in this area. And he's going to speak to, from a franchising perspective, how some of these regulations have an impact on those small businesses and the franchise community. So I will kick it off. And Karen, why don't you get started?
Thank you, Patrice. As Patrice mentioned, I'm here from California, which is ground zero for really bad labor policies. the most draconian of which is AB 5, which was signed into law in September of 2019, and it's been wreaking havoc on independent contractors and small businesses ever since. It went into effect in January of 2020. I personally, I'm a third-generation Southern Californian. I've been a freelance writer, managing editor, and professional photographer for almost 25 years. And when this law passed, I knew it was an existential threat to my career, and it would also affect my ability to be a caregiver to my mother, because I knew I was going to have to move home and take care of my elderly mother, and also be able to make a living while I'm at home, you know. So that was the main driver for me to start this Facebook group, because I wanted to find out what other professions would be affected by this law. And as soon, as I started it in November 2019, the stories started pouring in from across the vast swath of professions. And people were starting to lose their livelihoods and their careers overnight, lose their clients. They were blindsided by it. Even before the law went into effect, theaters started closing, musicians weren't able to perform, independent healthcare workers were having to abandon their clients and their patients. Writers weren't able to write, for their clients or their newspapers or whatever. We had videographers, like I said, theaters, children's theaters, festivals closing. It was just a complete dumpster fire even before it went into effect. So eventually, I just had a front row seat to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of horror stories from across the vast swath of professions, and we've identified more than 600 categories of professions that have been affected negatively in some way by AB 5. Now, of course, 9 months later, the author of the bill, Lorena Gonzalez, who is now the head of the California Labor Federation. California Labor Federation, obviously, they were the sponsor of AB 5, so it was a very incestuous policy to begin with. She picked winners and losers and granted exemptions to chosen few. Of course, what people don't realize about those 100 exemptions is that a lot of them come with caveats and fine prints, and they don't really work in the real world, and we can talk more about that. How it affects small businesses is if you're found to misclassify an independent contractor, whether you're a little small business, a mom and pop, using a videographer, for a couple of months or whatever, it could put you out of business when the EDD conducts their payroll audits on your business. So we've had devastating stories from small business owners in our group who've been audited by the EDD, and it's always the little guy that gets hurt the most. Of course, Julie Sue, who is now the acting Secretary of Labor. She came from California. She endorsed and enforced AB 5 as the labor commissioner there. We can talk a lot more about that. And so, thanks for having me.
We'll learn more about AB 5 in the Q&A discussion. Go ahead, Carrie. Terrific. Well, thanks so much. My name is Carrie Lucas, and I am the president of Independent Women's Forum. And Independent Women's Forum is a nonprofit, much like the Heritage Foundation. We are dedicated to economic freedom, limited government. But it is interesting, as it's also a small organization with about 35 employees that are W-2 employees, and we are currently all women. And it's interesting because obviously we write on issues like paid leave, childcare, overtime regulations, and workplace flexibility, but we also live it. And I've been with Independent Women's Forum for 20 years. I joined as a young, newly married woman, and was a policy analyst, and started having kids, and I started making my own case for flexibility with my employer at the time. And then years later, with Independent Women's Forum, we decided that it was silly to have to force a whole lot of people to come into an office when so much of our work was behind was on computers, and we could connect in different ways. We saved a lot of money and began hiring people, not in the DC area, but around the country. And this has really meant that
what it's given a new, I think, perspective for me as looking at public policies as what we're talking about when we talk about workplace flexibility. Because a lot of times I think when folks on Capitol Hill, and particularly so-called labor experts on the left, talk about we are going to make sure that we provide flexibility, and that means that you're going to have the right to take 4 hours off, every month or whatever for this certain bucket of leave time. But we know, I know as both as a mom and as a worker who has been juggling responsibilities in addition to my employment responsibilities, or as a human being that has family, both parental and extended family responsibilities, that's not what flexibility means. And I've been very fortunate that we have been able to offer to some young women starting out, and then people at different stages of life, true workplace flexibility. And I am concerned about what it means if the government comes in and starts mandating things and making it so it's no longer a conversation that I can have one-on-one with each unique person, each unique woman, to just determine what her her trade-offs are and what she envisions, and instead having to focus, number one, on making sure that I'm complying with the image of flexibility that a faceless bureaucrat is going to be imposing on all of us, which is really, one size fits all is the enemy of flexibility. So that's it for me. Thank you.
Wow, it's a tough crowd to follow. Good morning. I'm Clement Troutman, and I'm glad to be here. Thank you to the Heritage Foundation for inviting me back, and for all the hard work you all do to keep that torch high for us. Owner of Tropical Smoothie Cafe, a franchise owner after my naval career. Retired from that and then became an IT professional in the field of cybersecurity. Had those special badges and codes and all that kind of stuff. You guys know that stuff. But the bottom line is that after my daughter mentioned to me about the smoothie industry, again, I'm a baby boomer, I'm gonna give you hope, right? I hadn't had a smoothie before, okay? But I was coming from a meeting with a colleague, and he asked me, had you ever been to a tropical smoothie cafe? And I said, no. We stopped there, I had a smoothie and a wrap, and I resigned, I said, I gotta go. They said, what are you gonna do? I said, I'm gonna sell smoothies, right? So, but why do I say it that way? Because in all of us, there's an entrepreneurial spirit. We may not talk about it, we may not share it, right? But inside of us, there's something that we're thinking about, right? It may not make sense to anyone else, but it's there, And after I stopped that day, it just, boom, there it was. And so we got started with no experience, and we've been very fortunate to have a great team, and with my family and I, to build our brand and have the #1 producing tropical smoothie nationally, and we're expanding there with 3 or 4 more under construction, and as well as another concept in PJ's Coffee. So all that I'm saying to say this. While I was in the Navy, I traveled the world, worked with the finest men and women on the planet in preserving our freedoms. Freedom has never been free. Right now, there are ships underway. There are people in arduous conditions to make sure we have an opportunity to have discussions. And here we are, as the gentleman mentioned, that here we are still having discussions, right? What I realize as an entrepreneur, because I've had the opportunity to sit on both sides of the table, if you will, I've been the employee and the employer, right? And in seeing that, we come to realize that we do have what it takes. We've been conditioned to think that we don't. Now, the example I give is that there was a customer who came into our cafe just the other day. I'm sitting in the patio, and I'm out in the patio area, and it's a mom. She's got 2 small children. One's just finished playing his football game. He was 4 years old with pads on. I couldn't believe it. He's a little guy, right? But his little sister was 2, right? And they've got their smoothie. So that's a perfect scene for a business owner like myself, tropical smoothie. If you've got a cup, man, I'm winning, right? And it's healthy. But as they passed by, I noticed not the little boy who was 4, but his little sister who was 2. And she's holding that smoothie cup with 2 hands, right? And they get to cross the street in the parking lot, and the mom goes to grab her arm, and she pulls away. She didn't want to be pulled. She didn't want to be bossed around. There's a lot of us like that right now, getting bossed around. But you were conditioned not to be. You were conditioned. You were born to be independent. You were born to be what your dreams allow you to be. We've been conditioned to think that we can't do things. I don't know why we're talking about unions. You see, at the end of the day, we can speak for ourselves. I realize that if I'm speaking for myself, I don't need a representative. Isn't that something? I'm not a politician, right? I'm just speaking truth, right? See, I realize that if I can do it, you can do it. When we talk to our staff, we talk about that. We have single moms, that are excited about the opportunity to serve our community and, the things we're doing. We have single moms delivering today, matter of fact, a team coming in, right? And they do amazing things. Their resilience is off the chart. I have in my phone, I have a digital card. I'm a baby boomer. This is a big deal to me. I have a digital card app, right, where I can scan it for business card. But it was a Gen Z young man named Brian who showed me how to do it. He said, Mr. Troutman, you're traveling? Here, let me see your phone. And he set it up for me. So now I show it off everywhere I go. I'm gonna show you guys later. We're all still learning, right? And the challenge, the thing I see most is that, first of all, we somehow start to believe that everyone's smarter than we are. Let me explain. This plane's taking off. It's got the pilot, and the pilot's carrying the President of the United States, the smartest man in the world, a schoolgirl, and an elderly gentleman. The plane gets up 30,000 feet, starts having turbulence. They have 4 parachutes on there, and so what happens is the pilot puts it on autopilot and says it's too rough, and he grabs one of the parachutes and jumps. Now, mind you, there's 4 of them there, and there's only 3 parachutes left. And it's on autopilot. So the President of the United States says, well, for the sake of the nation, I hope you guys understand I'm gonna have to leave. And he grabs one of the parachutes and jumps, now there's 2 left. Smartest man in the world goes, well, you understand, because of my superior intellect, I'm gonna have to take one and jump as well. He jumps. Now there's 1 parachute and the 2 of them, the senior gentleman and the schoolgirl. And so the gentleman says, young lady, you go ahead and take the last chute. I'm gonna go now with this plane in a blaze of glory and let them know, and you just tell my story. And she's laughing hysterically. She said, young lady, you gotta go now. We don't have much time. And, in this face of danger, how can you be so calm? And she goes, sir, we're gonna be fine. He goes, but this plane is going down. There's only 1 chute left. She goes, no, sir, we're gonna be fine, because the smartest man in the world, he took my book bag. Sometimes we don't want to be the smartest one. Sometimes you got to know that people may appear to think they know more than you, but they really don't. See, this is a government of the people, by the people. We've gotten to a point now that the prisoners are running an asylum almost. They're telling us what we can do instead of we telling them. We got some work to do. I apologize for that, but that's where my thought process is.
I don't apologize. I think that's a very indicative story of what we're talking about, which is a bureaucracy and the technocrats who think they can micromanage a perfect economy and a perfect business everywhere, and they certainly can. So we'll pick up on some of those things that you talked about and you talk about with your workers. But Karen, I'll jump to you first. So you talked about California's AB5, which is just reclassifying independent contractors across the state as employees. And for those, you had media outlets that said, oh, this is wonderful. And then 2 days later, they laid off like most of their freelancer workforce because they know they can't afford the increased costs of hiring someone as a full employee. When your employers have to provide unemployment benefits, they have to healthcare benefits, all types of benefits, and state mandated, federal mandated benefits. So it raises costs. And just to give a little bit of some numbers, labor costs for reclassification lead to a 20 to 30% increase on costs for businesses. The cumulative effect of a federal reclassification of the 65 million plus freelancers across this country, according to the American Action Forum, we're looking at adding 18 to $62 billion of additional weekly costs for businesses. So up to $62 billion in weekly costs if you reclassify all of these workers as employees. That's the employer side. Right, that's the increased cost for employers. But Karen, talk to us about the other side, which is the freelancers, the independent contractors who suddenly have no choice about whether or not they can get hired or what they can do with their time anymore. So discuss now what happened in California. Talk to us about some of the different industries and how the people have been affected.
Well, most of the people that were in my group did not get offered any kind of a job. They just got terminated, or they lost their clients, or they lost their assignments. And so, and if they were offered a job, it would be something that they wouldn't be interested in because it would be less income for them. It would probably be, part-time, if that, which would not produce the benefits that the lawmaker, touted would happen with AB5. The ABC test is the draconian worker classification test in California. It's the strictest classification test in the nation, and people just couldn't. You can't pass it. Your contracting relationship, it's nearly next to impossible. So we have examples in our group of people like a pharmacist, for example, who is an independent contractor, and she had a career inspecting pharmacies up and down the state. Well, pharmacists don't have an exemption in AB5, so she was blindsided and lost her long-time career overnight. She has a doctorate degree, but she's not allowed to work on her own terms. She's still not. She's a friend of mine. She lives up the street from me. Theaters in California is a very well documented how small theaters and intimate theaters and regional theaters and opera companies and dance companies and the arts, the nonprofit arts, are just being destroyed by AB5 because these like Patrice was saying, putting every single person on payroll, including somebody who's only working for you for a single day or for an hour, would increase the cost of a single production by almost 50%, and sometimes more. So a lot of these theaters started closing down even before the pandemic lockdown. So when the pandemic hit, it gave the lawmakers a great shield to hide behind, because they could blame all these closures on the pandemic, when in reality, now that theaters are coming back, it's not the pandemic that they can't recover from, it's AB5. And so you have it affects women, seniors, students, particularly seniors. A lot of seniors, people who are supplementing their income, with the independent contracting gig or whatever, they're not going to get hired. So I have just so many heartbreaking stories in my group of seniors who lost everything, particularly women. California is the only place in the entire world where Rev.com and other freelance transcription platforms will not work with you. So that is a profession that is dominated by females and seniors, and it's extinct in California. And I have dozens and dozens and dozens of women in my group who lost everything because of AB5.
Well, Carrie, picking up on the women angle, a lot of these regulations hit at working women, but who also have to balance caregiving, caring for aging parents, even their own health issues and concerns. And, running an organization where we're all remote, flexibility is so important. But I think about what the overtime rule that was just implemented, or just proposed, right before Labor Day. What would that mean to IWF to have an increase in the number of people who would now qualify for overtime for a small business organization where a lot of where you run it on flexibility?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think so often with regulations and a lot of these programs that the government is trying to enforce to help employees, from the employer standpoint, it's really not about money. It's not that it's not even the begrudging a few extra dollars. What we're talking about is compliance and the freedom and kind of defining jobs, where if you think about the women who we hire who are just out of college and are getting this, what I consider like a really cool opportunity to work for a group like ours, where you do have flexibility, but you also have, you can make of this what you will, and it's a job where you can move up very quickly, but we're not policing exactly how many hours somebody is going to work. And there's a lot of shades of gray. I bet that a lot of you in this room, if you're in the policy world like me, when you're listening to a podcast, but you're also unloading the dishwasher, or you're reading articles that are interesting to you over the weekend. Is that work or is that pleasure? When for me, it doesn't matter, because my job is my passion, it's my hobby, it's the thing I want to do. But if I had to clock, you're listening to, you're watching this while you're folding laundry over the weekend, that shouldn't matter to me. But if I have to pay you overtime, if I have to know exactly how many hours you spent working, suddenly I do have to police those things. Working from home becomes a huge challenge in terms of regulatory compliance. And it's going to make employers, like an IWF, but a whole lot of other organizations, have to minimize their exposure, so hire fewer people that might end up working overtime, micromanaging them, limiting their opportunities. So, right now, if somebody wants to write an op-ed, I say, sure, as long as you've done your other work, let's go. And I don't care if you spent 6 hours or 1 hour on it. But if it's an overtime thing, then we would have to police it. It's just, it's incredibly limiting and destroys opportunity, particularly for those who are starting out.
Clement, I would love for you to also talk about the overtime rules, but then in addition, we're expecting a number of proposed rules to be finalized, one of which is the joint employer rule, and that deals with franchises. So talk to us about what both of those, both overtime, what could happen mean for your business, but also what the joint employer, what you're expecting would be an outcome for your business with that one.
Okay, let me talk about overtime. And, from an employer perspective, it's always going to be about, cost benefit, right? We look at, but the bottom line is that most owners, we're not the bad people, okay, that going to get our teams. We're committed to them. We have families. We currently have a family in our cafe of roughly 50. Right? And they come to us and they talk about all kinds of things, right? What's going on in their lives and what their fears are and things like that. And we go to the graduations and all those things that matter in their lives, right? And mind you, they're tomorrow's leaders as well. Okay, so when it comes to salaried employers versus, let's just say, overtime. I have a store manager, Randy Blaine. Wonderful young lady, single mom, right? 2 kids. She's salaried, and things come up at the school, right? Unexpected. And she has to cut out to go take care of things, right? It doesn't impact her pay because she's salaried. She has the flexibility to go do that and still take care of her family and still come back and do her job. Now, if we have to go hourly because of certain mandates, right? That can impact her having that flexibility. The cost, because there's a cost assigned to that overtime, right? And so we have to look at our P&Ls, our profit and loss statements, and make decisions based on that. So in other words, if to get the same work done, we have to pay overtime, after a certain number of hours, then maybe we have to go in a different direction, as you're mentioning, right? Because of the costs. If the costs are too high, our doors are closed and no one gets paid. No one gets served, no one gets paid. Bottom line. We have to keep the doors open. We're committed to the community. They rely on us, the jobs we create. But the cost can only go so high, you see? And so what happens is it's a lose-lose scenario. If I need to close and I need 2 managers, right, to do the close at night, and there's security implications there instead of 1, 2 experienced managers. Well, one of them may have already hit their 40 hours, but now, they're over 40 hours, now we got to pay them overtime. Well, now, instead of having 2 managers close, I have a manager and a shift lead, not the same levels of experience. It impacts the business itself, right? They're not at the same level, right? So these are the implications of, again, overtime or mandates for overtime, if you will, that it immediately impacts small businesses from my perspective. Joint employer, joint employer is bad. That's bad news. It is really bad news, okay? You guys, do I talk? I'm not a politician, right? Y'all know that, all right? But joint employer is not good. What it means is that, again, back to my service in the Navy, is to preserve free enterprise and capitalism. So we have the independence to make decisions and chase our dreams. Joint employer is really saying that for franchising that, and I've been working with the IFA, the International Franchise Association, to get this message out, is that so if you have a dream to take care of your family and your legacy and all those things that America's built on, people come from around the globe for an opportunity, just an opportunity, right, for the free enterprise system. Joint employer is saying that, no, we're going to let big corporations mandate what you do in your business, right? We're going to take care of Randy Blaine or her family. We're going to do it at our level, even though you don't know her. They don't know her, right? They're going to make all decisions for their well-being. They're going to be at the basketball games and the soccer games and make sure they have all the right kinds of cleats and that kind of thing and take the pictures with them. And they're going to do it from a corporate perspective, right? The other part of that is, as a business owner, what is my incentive? To be in business, when you're a business owner, you don't take a coffee break. You don't take a 10-minute break. You don't clock hours. You don't know how long it takes. You do it until it's done, right? You have no concept of time, right? Matter of fact, you need people in your life, in your circle, to protect you from yourself because you're servant focused. You're just laser sharp. As the saying goes, a hound dog in a hunt don't know he got fleas, right? That's the mindset when you're chasing your dream. And whatever your dream is, I guarantee you have that. I was laser focused when I met my wife, Jackie. It didn't make sense, right? But I was focused, But joint employer is something that says that if the corporate entities, and now we have a partnership in franchising, and franchising is the best thing I think ever happened in American culture because it gives people like myself, growing up in the project, my brother John sitting right there, right? He could tell you that we grew up in the projects. We had nothing except a dream, And although I took the scenic route traveling the world, here's a system that was in place to allow me to still be in business for myself. A turnkey model with support when it's running properly, it's a win-win for the brand and for the franchisee. It's truly a win-win opportunity, right? For the masses of the people, you see? And so to have that, placed in jeopardy is not really good for America. I know it's in like 805 franchises across the country. And in the food service sector, I was at the Prosper Forum in Florida just recently with a whole bunch of CEOs, and they're talking about feeding America. In the food sector, hunger is the biggest challenge globally. And in franchising and joint employer, all these things contribute to those issues. So we got a lot of work to do.
Yeah. All right, we're going to jump to Q&A. The time has gone by so quickly. I still have more questions, but I'm going to open this up to questions from the audience. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. All right, if you're still thinking, I'll jump to another question. Oh, we've got one? Okay.
I know I'm the mic runner, but I do have a question for all of you. Good morning, by the way. Thank you, both panels, for being here at the Heritage Foundation. I'm an intern with development. My name is Peter Ballos, junior in my undergrad. I had a question for all of you about Gen Z and their upcoming employment. And there's a Forbes article that came out in May, late May. 65% of Gen Zers are actually fired when they join the professional workplace. I know we talk a lot about pursuing opportunities and the independence of the American dream and creating those dreams into reality. So how can we approach Gen Zers who have this opportunity but cannot make the most of it due to their upbringing or maybe being quote unquote babied along the way? How can we best approach this kind of issue in terms of how they can really thrive in the professional setting at such a young age?
Okay, sure. I'll go first. So I've stated before that we all wear this invisible sign, right? And it simply reads, please remind me that I matter. I'm somebody. That's where it starts, right? If we do that with our team to do the heavy lifting, they're 17 years old, 17, 18 years of age, Gen Z, right? But what happens is I work for them. They don't work for me. I represent them, and I let them know that. Communicating to them, being transparent. I think we've gotten to a place where we put expectations on Gen Z that we haven't even mastered ourselves, right? And what they're doing is looking for truth, right? They need to know that, I wasn't perfect. I made some mistakes. That's how we learn. Failing does not make you a failure, right? So if we do that and we earn their trust, because it has to be earned, and to show them the ways for opportunity, right? In other words, I think I was mentioning earlier, I talk to our team when they come in and I let them know what our goals are, where we're headed, and we're going to serve 1 million people, and we can only do it if we got the very best to do this job. It's a big job. The question is, are you the best? Am I talking to the right person? Guess what they're going to say? Absolutely. Of course you are. And remind them that they matter because they are they're the future, right? Tomorrow's leaders come through our businesses. We have to pay attention, right? We need them, and they appreciate that, and they'll work twice as hard.
Just to jump in, I think you're absolutely right that I think it's interesting when you think about the what the messages that may have been lost in particular for the younger generation. And I do think making this recognition that work is in itself fulfilling, and that you can take pride in a job well done, and this idea that that all work has inherent value, whether you're the person taking notes and running the mic around or doing whatever the first job you get when you're starting at a new organization, that there is this inherent. There's nothing wrong with it. It's not being belittled. That it is that you deserve and will receive respect for performing that job well, and then showing these paths of upward mobility. One thing that I saw when looking at some of the differences between Gen Z and older generations is this idea of this prioritization of flexibility, and that people don't want to work in like a 9-to-5 job. And in some ways, I find that it's hard because there's sometimes when showing up is important. You need to staff your hospital, you need to staff your smoothie shop, there's a lot of places where showing up is important, and it's not all being stuck in an office a cartoonish office-like environment. But knowing that there are these different pathways, that there are opportunities that you don't have to be in kind of that factory, cartoonish idea of what a 9-to-5 job is. But you've got to figure it out, that you've got to lean in and find some place for yourself to make a contribution for your own good, as not just financially, although financially matters too, but also for that sense of purpose.
I would recommend to anybody of any age that if you want to start your own business, don't move to California. Because Steve Jobs, who started Apple Computer in his garage in California, you're not going to see that anymore there. It's not. It's just so draconian there and onerous for the small business owner in California.
Thank you.
And sadly, that can spread to the rest of the country if we're not vigilant. And whether it's through the legislative process, the Protecting the Right to Organize PRO Act, or whether it's through the Department of Labor's regulations, which we're expecting the independent contractor rule to be finalized any day now, the opportunities can and very well could disappear very quickly. Other questions? Oh, I've got a couple. Okay, we'll go there, and then we'll go to the back.
How much of this do you think is based on simple public confusion or misunderstanding of the nature of these work organizations and relationships? I mean, I think part of the problem, for example, with franchising is a lot of people don't realize that these are independent businesses and not run by the parent corporation, or in the case of California, that a lot of these people are actually not working for whom they appear, not working in the conventional sense for whom they appear to be working, but actually working as freelancers. And this just happens to be like their most common client, for example.
That's a really good question, and that's my biggest challenge, raising awareness and educating people about AB5, because the narrative is always Uber and Lyft and exploited janitorial and all of that. They frame it around certain industries, when in fact the dolphins in the tuna net, which are all these other professions that are caught up in it, it's deliberate. It's by design. It's not a bug. It's a feature of the law. And so in California, because of Prop 22, which exempted rideshare and delivery from AB5 via a ballot initiative, people get that confused with AB5, and they think that it exempted all gig workers, which it doesn't, or that it repealed all of AB5, which it doesn't. And even allies, in the fight, they get their facts wrong. They don't have their facts straight about AB5. It has not been repealed. It's alive and well. The exemptions don't, solve the problem, because the exemptions, there's about 100 of them, but they all come with caveats and fine print, and you may or may not be able to find a pathway to take advantage of that exemption. For example, tutors are listed as a profession that's supposedly exempt from AB5, but when you look at the details of the law, there's 11 caveats that you have to meet in order for that profession to be able to operate, in order to have an independent contracting relationship with an online tutor. And so most tutoring companies cannot operate like that in the real world. You wouldn't be allowed to provide curriculum. You wouldn't be allowed to provide training or branding or anything like that. So it's a lot of pulling the rug out from under people. And then the narrative just gets tossed by the wayside. People fall through the cracks. And even people that should know better, like legislators that are on our side, they don't know what's happening day to day with AB5, and particularly how it's affecting small businesses that are being audited with these really ruthless, aggressive payroll tax audits by the EDD for the crime of having an independent contractor. So we have like photographers in our group, for example. They have an exemption from AB5, but we've got photographers coming in saying they're getting audited by the EDD for bringing on a second shooter to a wedding. And so when we follow the trail of what the auditors are telling them, they're saying, oh, well, just by virtue of the fact that you've told them where and when to show up, it's control and direction, so you violated the A prong of the ABC test, and we're going to fine you $100,000 or whatever it is, and so it's just the real horror stories about AB 5 are taking place in the small business community with the moms and pops and the solopreneurs, people like architectural renderers and music stores, and just the little guys getting audited for having an independent contractor here or there.
Also, I'll piggyback on that. And shout out to Matt Holler of the IFA. I mean, the IFA guys, they do an amazing job in supporting franchising in particular and getting the education out there. But anyway, we got a chance to meet with Julie Sue, Secretary of Labor, and in talking with Ms. Sue, and talking about franchising and its importance, she was reminded that as the descendant of an immigrant herself, that her parents, owned a Shake Shack, which is a franchise, right? So it was like an aha moment for her that, oh, okay, this really does work. Absolutely, it works. She was a benefactor from it. So how you gonna vote against it? I mean, so we just had one of those kind of moments briefly.
Well, I also met with Julie Sue, and she claims that the ABC test is not going to be implemented into federal law via the 6-factor DOL rule that's going to be, finalized probably next month. But in reality, when you look at the 184-page regulation, it mimics the ABC test from California anyway, so she's very duplicitous with her answers.
I think we have time for maybe one more question right here in the back.
Yeah, I could hold it. Okay, all right. It just feels weird. Thank you all for being here. I actually am from California, and I do know individuals who have been very negatively affected by the AB 5 law, so I am sympathetic to your arguments. I was wondering, when I talk to individuals on the left, they often make the argument that workers' real wages have stagnated against inflation over the last several decades, and unions obviously have a wage premium that they provide to workers by entering into these associations by which they restrict employment. And so I was wondering, and obviously, that raises costs and decreases economic output, and I'm not, arguing in favor of that, but I was wondering, what do you think is like an effective messaging strategy to attack that, given that the wage premium is true?
Well, so in terms of pushing back on the unionization argument?
Well, given just pushing back on like everything that's kind of bundled within like the PRO Act, for example.
I can take a quick crack at that. It's interesting because I do think that I think everybody in this room sympathizes that there has been too little wage growth. One of the interesting statistics, if you look over the recent decades, is the cost of employment. Because when you're hiring somebody, it's not about how much money you're going to get to put in that person's pocket. It matters on how much it costs to employ that person, and the costs associated with labor have been steadily going up, especially as taxes and as benefit costs go up. So sometimes the costs, people are investing more in employees. It's just not making it to people's paychecks at the same rate. And I do think that it's important. I would go a step further also and talk about when we think about overall compensation. This often happens a lot, as when we think about like women being how much women make in terms of how much men make from their jobs, and everybody's heard about the wage gap, and women on average take home less. And one of our challenges to talk about, okay, but you know what else like men do? They spend more hours on the job, so that explains the wage gap. They tend to get hurt and do dangerous, distasteful jobs like working in prisons or on top of hot roofs, and where women tend to have more comfortable jobs. There's other forms of compensation, and I think particular when we think about union intervention, the unions are focused on one size fits all, protecting worker, not giving opportunities for individual workers to find the kind of compensation that they want, which, especially when you talk about women and people who are seniors, the disabled, people, students who have other responsibilities, We don't want that, what the union is going to offer. And if the union is offering one thing, what we, it's destroying opportunities that will actually work for these individuals.
The California Labor Federation is a sponsor of AB 5, and the author of AB 5 now is the leader of the California Labor Federation. The California Labor Federation represents 1,200 unions. It's the largest labor organization in the state of California, 2.2 million workers. They want to put independent contractors out of business. They do.
I think we can squeeze in one more question. I thought I saw one in the back corner. We still have that question, sir? Please go ahead.
It is becoming apparent and so obvious that our opposition that puts in place such policies and laws are well-heeled and well-financed. Where is our economic powerhouse that would partner with us to push our agenda and our policies? Where is our billionaire class, like the opposition has theirs, to bring our issues that we're so hard struggling for to make reality, climbing that uphill battle?
Okay, so, again, it's back to free enterprise. Again, all for jobs, of course, working jobs and everything else, to do what it is we need to take care of our families, or people work jobs for different reasons, right? Everyone may not want to be a business owner, but you may be working in an industry that you want to serve that community, that industry. Our firefighters and our law enforcement professionals, our servicemen and women, that protect us, they do the work, again, not necessarily just for pay, right? Because if they were doing it just for pay, they probably would move on to do something else. But there is a sense of duty tied to why we choose certain areas, right? But at the same time, when it comes to economic empowerment, right? Again, as was mentioned here, a position is designed for, because again, there's limited costs, right? And as a small business owner, I can only pay so much, right? If our positions, let's just say, is in a range of 70 to 80,000 for a manager, but what you're looking for, if the person's looking for 150,000, I can't do that, right? It's not. It wouldn't happen with us. That doesn't mean you can't do it. It just wouldn't be with our business. And every business has to make those kind of decisions, right? They have to look at their bottom lines. They have to have costs and labor costs and the MOPS and everything else that has to be paid for, right? And so, in making these decisions, we try to do the very best we can to find out, at least in my place, is to make sure that the team we can develop really wants to be there. Or we have two requirements that I have for our team. Either you're going to grow with us because you're looking to be in the food service industry, you want to grow to different levels, or maybe become a business owner yourself, or you're going to grow outside of us. But at the end of the day, we have to kind of identify and grow from that. And that economic empowerment is going to be a part of that. If we could show them how to be in business for themselves, there's no ceiling.
Sorry, Carrie.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
We're going to have to close it there, but I want to thank the panel for joining us. Let's put our hands together and thank for Karen Anderson, Carrie Lucas, and Clement Troutman for joining us today. And please stick around for the next panel.
Position. So we were just talking about issues like the joint employer and independent contractor, and you might wonder, why would anybody want to take away this good thing that's giving a proven business model? Why would anybody want to take away jobs where 90+% of independent contractors are choosing that and they don't want the traditional job? And that answer is because the impetus is to get more people into jobs that can be unionized. Unions are driving all these regulations, and I think this also relates to your question on Gen Z. We've seen an increased support for unions. I think in part we've seen the shift of, oh, there was helicopter parenting and now there is bulldozer parenting that paves the way for you ahead. And I think that there's the notion that the union can be that bulldozer that's going to pave the way for me. But that's one path that they're paving. So that doesn't allow the opportunity for the individual to follow their own path throughout the way. And so I think that we'll hear a lot of that now from this next panel up, which Vinny Vernuccio of the Institute for the American Worker is going to host.
Great, thank you, Rachel. And thank you, Rachel, and thank you to Heritage for putting together this great event today. And very excited about this panel, the role of unions in the 21st century. I'm Vinny Vernuccio. I'm president of Institute for the American Worker. I'm also a senior fellow at the Mackinac Center and their Workers for Opportunity project. The reason why I am so excited about this panel, I've had a couple of great conversations over the last few days with our panelists, is, I hate to say it, no offense to some of the people for us, but this is the real people panel. This is people that are on the front lines, no offense, except for Sean, and myself a little bit, policy wonks here. But we're going to be hearing about what's going on the ground with unionization. And the title is Unionization, or the role of unions in the 21st century. And this may be a little bit of blasphemy, but I think there is a role for unions in the 21st century. But if they adapt, if they focus, like Carrie was just talking about, on the individual worker as opposed to the workers, plural, one-size-fits-all contracts. If they work with employers and show value to employers instead of having that adversarial us against them relationship, which unfortunately is all too prevalent, and we're seeing now with what's coming out of the UAW, especially with their strike. So I think there is a role, there is a good role, but unfortunately, most unions aren't there right now, and we're going to hear some of that. So I want to start, and I'm going to go down with introductions, then we'll start with opening statements. But with Michael Elkhorn, who is a crew member at Trader Joe's, and if any of you know my wife, you know that our fridge is full of Trader Joe's food. And I actually have my sister-in-law is a manager at Trader Joe's, so we are very close to the Trader Joe's family. So I sympathize, and he's going to tell you a little bit about what happened when the union came calling to his store in Trader Joe's. And to his left is Brian Refsnyder, who is a former vice president of labor relations and unfortunately former at Yellow Trucking, which the unions literally drove out of business. So he's going to talk about that experience and some of the unfortunate things of the Teamsters not giving an inch to Yellow and rather seeing it go out of business than work with them and make sure their employees stayed on the jobs. And then closing us out, we're going to have Sean Higgins from the Competitive Enterprise Institute. He's a research fellow over there. And I know we want to look forward on this panel, but you can't look forward without knowing where you came from. So he's going to give a little bit of the history of the major labor law in the United States, the National Labor Relations Act, and then I think we're going to talk about some of the policies and some of the both regulations and legislation that we've already touched on. But with that, Michael, can you just get us started and tell us a little bit about your experience? And I tell you, when we were chatting last night and you were going through some of the angst that you had with the union and some of the hostility that they brought, I was actually just ticking some of the regulations and the things in the Protecting the Right to Organize Act that, wow, this is why that's bad. So with that, just tell us a little bit about your experience.
Sure. Thank you to the Heritage Foundation for giving me this platform. I feel like me and a lot of my coworkers felt like our voices really weren't being heard by the media and sort of the narrative of the unions when we voted not to have a union in our store, although the union did go through in our store. Most of us in my workplace, I would say, we were coming from a place where we just thought maybe all unions are good. We hadn't really experienced much with unions. We had a great workplace at Trader Joe's, but we were probably all going to say we were pro-union before this union campaign. But when it happened to us, it came as a surprise to a lot of us. There were a lot of our coworkers who were organizing for many months before a lot of us heard about it. And these are coworkers that we're very close with. We had close relationships with everybody in the store. So it was a bit of a shock to us to have them come to us months later. And I'll just kind of give an introduction for what happened to me. My coworker called me and said, first of all, you can't tell anybody we're talking about this. You might get fired. I might get fired. So that's the way they started. And some of us are thinking of forming a union at Trader Joe's in this store. To which I said, I don't think we need a union, but it sounds like some of my coworkers think we do. So certainly I'd be open to talking about it with my coworkers. So I think I naively thought there'd be like a group meeting and we would all get together like as a crew and talk about this. But they took that to mean that I was ready to have a vote. And the next day they petitioned Trader Joe's for a union vote and claimed that they had majority support and wanted Trader Joe's to recognize the union outright without an election. And that means almost half of my crew was left out of all of that decision making. So as a result of that, and the video that they made, a bunch of press releases talking about our workplace environment, many of us felt really shocked and we didn't agree with what was being said. We felt like there was a bit of a false narrative being created about our workplace to support unionization, but not really on the merits of a bad work environment. So many of us were against this union from the start, and it's been a year, and we're still against this union because they've done nothing but be adversarial. They've gotten us nothing, and it seems that their only tactic or leverage, as they see it, is to have a social media campaign against Trader Joe's and make Trader Joe's look terrible, and also to silence those of us who don't agree. We were quickly told that we're moles for Trader Joe's, or we don't support our coworkers if we don't support a union. And all of that pressure was just a lot to take. And I feel like as a result, many of us in my store, and I know many crew members in other stores who said this union is not good and we're not voting for this union, feel like the media is missing this perspective of the workers who say, no, we stand by the fact that we didn't vote for this union, and we're not dumb. And Trader Joe's didn't union bust us to not vote for this union. This was a bad faith union to start, and it's still a bad faith union, and we're not going to join. So.
Great, thank you, Michael. I want to shift. So we just heard about union trying to come in. Brian, can you tell us what happened when the union came in, and tell us a little bit about your relationship with the union, and then eventually, I know everyone here is very anxious to hear what happened to Yellow Trucking, and unfortunately, why are you guys not around anymore?
Sure. Thank you very much for having me. So let me first start off and make sure that everybody understands Yellow as a company. Obviously, a unionized carrier, 30,000 employees. 23,000 are Teamsters. Yellow was going to celebrate 100 years in business. 100 years in business. When I started in trucking, back in the early 90s, there was over 20 plus unionized carriers. This year, they were down to 3. Now there's down to 2 LTL carriers, and that's it. Yellow was by far the largest LTL carrier in the union space. Like I said, 22,000 members. The other 2 don't only make up about 18th. Yellow was the 3rd largest LTL company in the industry. So large carrier. So I wanted everybody to understand the big picture of Yellow. Let me tell you a little bit about myself. I've spent 21 out of the 28 years in transportation, 21 years with unionized companies. I've been obviously very successful working with unions because I treated every person the same. Really, what I excelled at was getting out in front of the employees, communicating, sharing, giving them the tools to be able to do their job. And I've been able to grow from being a dock supervisor to running a small terminal to a large terminal to being a vice president to being the senior vice president of labor. And I would tell you that my last 2 years were in labor. And although I was in unionized trucking for my whole career, I wasn't really a labor guy. I didn't have labor issues at my terminals, because I had collaboration. I talked to my employees. I engaged my employees. When I asked them if we needed to go outside the contract, I always called the local. I got involved with the stewards. I worked with them. We worked out a way to take care of customers. That made me successful, which pushed me into this senior labor job, okay? Again, 23,000 people. My responsibility of when I took over labor, and I forgot to tell you this, Yellow is made up of YRC Freight, which covered the whole United States. If you guys remember, it was a Yellow roadway merger. They called it YRC Freight. And then Yellow also owned New Penn, was out in the East Coast. We also owned Holland, and we also owned a carrier Redaway. My responsibility when I took over labor was first to get those companies all combined. Eliminate the duplicity. They were all acting as separate companies, all doing their own deal. So it was my responsibility to get them all together and act as one, and it was going to be called One Yellow. My second responsibility was to make truckers happy. It was to take what I've done throughout the years, being successful, communicate, and make sure that that got transposed at the 260 locations throughout our terminal network, okay? And we did that. I can tell you we had a lot of success getting out in front of the employees, making sure we communicated, sharing what we were trying to do, why One Yellow was so critical, why it was so important that we were going to combine these companies. And you may ask, why did Yellow go into bankruptcy? Well, one of the key things is we had all these companies, they were acting as separate units. There was duplicity. There was times where we'd go make a pickup in a certain area at a customer, and instead of one driver making that pickup at that location, we had 3 different companies. We had the Holland brand, the New Penn brand, and the YRC brand. That's inefficient. Would you guys all agree with that? It's inefficient. So again, by merging the companies, there was opportunities to reduce expense. And that's where we went. So early on, before the new administration, when Hoffa was still in effect, he understood the plan. He understood what we were trying to do, why we're trying to do it, and it was going to work. We were going to modernize our network. Yellow had been around, like I said, for 100 years, and not much has changed. It was old and antiquated. It could not compete against the FedExes, the Sayas, the XPOs, the Old Dominions. It couldn't compete because we were not modernized. We were not doing things in a more efficient manner. And that's what we were going to create. And that's what we proposed to the union. We proposed that we're going to combine these companies. This is how we're going to do it. And I will tell you that the new administration wanted nothing to do with sitting down and figuring out how to make it work. Literally every opportunity where we would sit down with them, they would institute delay tactics, stall tactics, and they really wouldn't get down to, okay, this is what we're going to do, this is how we're going to do it. They were more worried about how the reputation of no concessions. That was the big thing they'd say over and over again, concessions, concessions, concessions. There wasn't one concession. We were actually going to pay the employees more money. Not one employee was going to lose their job, but we still couldn't get them to the table and just sit down and talk and work through it. So I'll stop there. I'm sure that you guys will probably have some questions as we go, but that's the background. So thanks, Vinny.
I have tons of questions, and I'm looking forward to Q&A. But before we get there, Sean, tell us where we've been. You had a great study with CEI on the history of the National Labor Relations Act, and then bring us to maybe some of the controversies today.
Yeah, the question is, how do we get here in the first place? How did the government get in this position of having to sort of manage labor relations in the U.S.? It goes back primarily to a law in 1933 called the National Industrial Recovery Act, which was one of the first major New Deal things by the then Roosevelt administration. This was the first law that gave all private sector workers collective bargaining rights. And the idea was this would help the workers raise their wages in the middle of this depression and help them out that way. It didn't work out the way Congress and the president intended. 2 things happened. First off, a lot of the existing labor organizations mounted a renewed effort to sort of organize a lot of businesses that had previously resisted unionization. This got extremely ugly. There were riots, there were fights, National Guard in some cases were called out. Dozens of people died in some of these incidents. It was not a good thing. And as a consequence of that, a lot of these businesses became extremely tied up. They were shut down, there was no production making, and this was at the height of the Great Depression, so this was a serious problem for the economy. On top of that, a lot of the businesses said, well, if collective bargaining is now a thing and we have to deal with it, let's just create unions of our own for our workers and make them join, and that'll solve the problem. And so they did that. You had like the General Motors employee representative organization, which you were somehow, a lot of people suddenly became members of. And if you stop and think about it, of course, a company-run union has a serious conflict of interest. It's not going to push for higher wages or better conditions for workers beyond what management is going to propose. So clearly, the National Industrial Recovery Act failed in its primary duty, and they had to figure out how to fix this. Along came a Senator Robert Wagner of New York, a Democrat. He recognized that the law was not working at all, and he came up with the National Labor Relations Act, which was basically fix-it legislation for this previous law. And he had to sort of deal with the fact that a lot of these unions existed, and he also had to deal with ensuring that the workers had collective bargaining rights in a way that sort of was meaningful. His solution to this was to say that, yes, we will ensure collective bargaining rights for workers, but we will ensure it as an individual right. The worker, it's the decision of the worker to join a union or not join a union, and they can't be coerced into doing this. And this was a consequence of these company-run unions that they had, that they're trying to sort of get rid of. So they established this, and this is all throughout the congressional debate of this. The senator is repeatedly clear about this. In fact, a lot of the comments about it are kind of humorous in this sort of exasperating sense of, you can sort of hear the exasperation in his voice. It's like, if I have to say it one more time. And yes, I read through all 500 pages of the congressional debate on this, which was every bit as scintillating as you might think, to sort of understand all this stuff. But when the law was written, they did include this brief sort of preamble of it, that the policy is encouraging, the word encouraging for collective bargaining is in there. And this has been cited by President Biden, by President Obama, by labor leaders like the late Richard Trumka and others to say, well, federal policy is encouraging workers to be in unions, not to be a neutral arbiter. Well, that's not really the case. That terminology is in there precisely because of these concerns about major disruptions. That language is also in there. And we have a good example of this type of scenario, which was about 2 years ago when the Biden administration forced a collective bargaining contract on the railways in order to prevent another big supply chain crisis. That was under the Railway Labor Act, but that was the type of scenario that section in the National Labor Relations Act that calls for encouraging collective bargaining was referring to. Otherwise, it's supposed to be the individual worker's right. And this factor has just simply been forgotten and overlooked as time has gone on. Why is this important? It's important because it provides a powerful sort of rhetorical advantage to the unions and their allies when they're discussing policy and legislation. And it relays into how a lot of these new laws that they're being pushed forward, or policies or regulations, are designed. I mean, things like card check, the Protecting the Right to Organize Act, they're all about not giving individual workers rights, but about giving unions more power to force workers to fall in line. They actually, things like the Protecting the Right to Organize Act have very little new rights for workers. They mostly strip away the rights of workers and just simply give the power to the union leaders to say, this is what you must do. And that's something that has to be understood. And we have to, if we can get back to understanding what the law was originally intended to do, and to understand it as an individual right as opposed to something that's collective and coercive, then I think we can actually get back to a better understanding of how labor relations should be and how they could work.
Great, thank you, Sean. And I just want to sum up, because I know there's been a lot of references to the Protecting the Right to Organize Act or the PRO Act. And it's basically the smorgasbord of bad ideas. And it's exactly what Sean said. It's, forcing workers into unions, mostly against their will. And Michael, I'm gonna go back to you, because I want to relate a lot of these policies to what you experience. You know, so, some of the things I know you didn't experience, such as the forcing people working for themselves to be classified as employees and therefore be able to be unionized. A full disclosure, I'm the president of Institute for the American Worker. I also mentioned I work with the Mackinac Center. I work with several others. I'm an independent contractor. So it's the old men's hair club, remember? Not just the president, I'm also a client. I live this. So I have great concerns over these IC attacks. It's what Clement was talking about with making joint employers, people, owners of franchise organizations into essentially employees, managers for large corporations and assuming they're employees. But it's also things like effectively eliminating the secret ballot in union organizing elections. And they couldn't pass, the PRO Act is dead, but the Biden administration knows that, so now they're doing much of the PRO Act via joint employer. We heard about the regulation. They are independent contracting, the regulation there at the Department of Labor, both of which we're waiting on, via regulations, DOL and NLRB, but they're also doing some of the more insidious ports. They recently, the NLRB recently announced their decision in the Cemex case, which is essentially doing backdoor card checks. So they're essentially allowing workers to have a secret ballot election, but then saying, well, if the union accuses the employer of something, we can just throw out that election and recognize the union via cards, via this process, as Sean said, card check, which allows intimidation and coercion. It also shortens the election period. So they have these quickie elections, and it does things, and the PRO Act also does things like banning employers from really talking to employees. It's something that, you know, the NLRB is also looking into. So with all of that background, because I was ticking this off, Michael, when we were chatting yesterday, let's go into a little bit more of what happened at Trader Joe's, and especially the way you felt that your voice was stifled or you didn't get all the information. And with that policy backdrop, tell us about more of your experience.
Yes, I think that it came as such a surprise to so many of us, and I think that was intentional. I've heard one of the union organizers say, we have to surprise the boss. And this really upsets me because I think, especially with the example of my workplace, which was a very positive workplace, and it wasn't surprise the boss. It was organize in secret and then surprise your coworkers and then make them feel as if they don't join this union, they don't care about their coworkers. And also don't talk to your coworkers who don't support this union because they are moles for the company. So it's as if my coworkers who I was very close with, had good relationships with, were forced to sort of turn against those of us who had our doubts. So we couldn't even have a conversation. It was kind of cultish. It was very cultish, I think. And so that experience came as a shock to a lot of us. And then when the union goes through and people present it like this is such a great thing, it's as if the workers who didn't vote for the union, they get no voice, you know? Oh, the union couldn't beat Trader Joe's in this fight. So those workers that didn't vote for the union, they weren't smart enough to realize how much they needed a union. So it's all very patronizing. And I find that really frustrating because I think that when people don't vote for a union, that should be respected and people should pay attention to that. Why didn't they vote for this union? But the assumption seems to be that it's union busting by Trader Joe's, which the union busting terminology was just something I feel like they used to silence most of us that had opposition or had questions about the union. They said, oh, that's union busting by Trader Joe's. So it really locked up our ability to even have a conversation with our coworkers. And in the middle of it, it happened so fast, we're thinking, okay, this union is not going to be good for us. There's a bit of lying going on, it's adversarial, so how can we fight back? And there just didn't seem to be much opportunity for us to fight back. I think we didn't realize you kind of need to have a counter campaign going on if you want to fight back. And the company wasn't giving us too much information, and everybody's like, the company's not allowed to do anything and everything they do is union busting. But honestly, I would have much rather had the company do more to keep me away from this union.
Mike, I'm going to ask you one more, and it's an inappropriate question. So I'm apologizing in advance, but hey, let's keep it interesting, right? Are you anti-union?
I'm not anti-union.
Just bad union.
Bad union, this union.
That's great. Brian, I'm going to shift over to you. Speaking of, a shift. You were talking about, working with the former Teamsters president, Jimmy Hoffa Jr., and the new administration came in. It sounds like you had a productive relationship, and that relationship shifted. Do you think the new administration wanted to reach a deal with you, or do they have another purpose?
Definitely a different purpose. So much so where, I talked about my background, that I was willing to adjust and make adjustments. To get this change of operations, to merge the 4 different companies together, you have to actually write a change of operations. I actually wrote the change of operations 3 times, based on the fact to try to accommodate feedback that I got from the local freight division. So we wrote it 100% contractually. They said, hey, listen, but it didn't work. And we said, okay, yeah, there's some things that didn't work, and we're going to change that. One of the things that didn't work is we struggled finding drivers who wanted to work at night and go work and drive to another center, work the dock there, and then drive back at night. Local drivers. We struggled finding people to do that job. But we had people in the next change of operations. We had 400 people out of the 1,000 that we were looking for do that job today, but they were different classification. So I said, what do you think? Let's change the way we write this. Let's not make it a utility change, but let's allow those road drivers to change classifications. And instead of looking for 1,000 people to do a new job, now we're only looking for 600. You would think, win-win situation for everybody. That's the buy-in we got from the freight division, but then all of a sudden, the leaders at the very top said, no way. No way are you going to do that. You guys are in collusion. Stop now. Do not talk to the company anymore. And it all stopped. And then we rewrote it as 100% contractual, and every step of the way, they delayed it. So much so where they really, even though they knew all the financials, they knew everything that the company was going through, they knew how long we could last before we would have to file bankruptcy, still did not act on that. So to answer your question, yes, they did.
What happened to your former employees?
23,000 Teamsters, okay? There's not 23,000 Teamster type jobs for these employees to go to. Although their leadership said, hey, listen, we'll find you all new jobs. But there's only a handful of union jobs, the UPSs, the T-Forces, the ABFs. So the guys that I know, they're having to find non-union jobs. And I can tell you that a lot of these non-union trucking companies do not want to hire a unionized driver because they're afraid, right? They're afraid that it's going to get organized and they're going to be in a bad situation. So they're in a very tough situation that did not have to happen at all. There's no reason why Yellow ever had to go out of business. Financing, everything was lined up. All we had to do was become one Yellow. Financing was handled. We would have continued doing business. We would have went on for another 100 years, modernizing our network.
Thanks. That is incredibly depressing. And I'm sorry for what you went through. I'm sorry for what your employees or former employees are going through because they weren't able to make a deal.
And I want to make one comment too. So this didn't just get to the highest Teamster level. This got to the highest levels of our government. This made it to the president, Secretary of Labor, Secretary of Transportation. There were multiple people that knew exactly what was going to happen and did not intervene.
Sean, we're going to go to Q&A right after you. I want you to bring us back up, please. Tell us about HOPE. Tell us about the Employee Rights Act.
Well, there are there are people who are noting these problems that we're discussing right now. There is the Employee Rights Act. There are things that are, which is it Congresswoman Fox is the primary author or sponsor?
Representative Allen and Senator Scott, and Congresswoman Dr. Fox is the chair of the committee.
Okay. Yeah. And the Employee Rights Act would address a lot of these issues that we've been talking about by empowering the individual workers to give them the right to say no, to walk out, to opt out of the union if they disagree with what it's doing. And I think that's the major problem here, because we have this issue where the unions are simply not responsive to the individual concerns or demands of their members. The way the law is written, unfortunately, it assumes that the union and the workers are one and the same, and therefore anything the union wants to do is the collective will of the workers, when that isn't necessarily or always automatically the case. I'm certain in the case, for example, of Yellow Cab, you know, the 23,000 Teamster members probably had a different opinion of the decision than maybe the Teamsters leadership as a whole does. And this law would give those workers an ability to hold their own union's feet to the fire, to address these concerns by allowing them to say, no, we don't want to financially support this union, or no, we want to walk away from it, or making it easier to say, look, we don't think you're doing the right job. We need to be able to, you know, force a possible recall of the union, recall election. And if these things happen, I think it'll empower those workers to hold the unions responsible and make them more reactive to the individual needs of the workers instead of the sort of the broader agenda of the labor movement as a whole.
Great, thanks, John. And yeah, and to be clear, the main highlights of the ERA are secret ballot protections. So making sure that employees, you know, have a private vote after they hear both sides of the story, protecting small business and franchise owners with a traditional definition of joint employers, protecting independent contractors like me, and allowing independent workers to work for themselves. When it comes to politics, allowing workers to opt in to paying union politics and not just automatically being assumed, and you know, a couple other very helpful provisions. But with that, would love to hear your thoughts for our great panel up here, and open it up to question and answer. I guess, Diana, do you want to get us started?
My name's Dinah Furch-Scott-Roth. I'm with the Heritage Foundation. Thank you very much for your comments. None of you seem to have spoken about the amount that is getting taken out of workers' paychecks for dues and initiation fees. And I imagine that is one reason that people don't want to join unions, especially in this era of inflation. Can you give us any idea of how much that is?
Yeah, for an employee at YRC Freight, the union dues were not that high. It was their hourly rate times a half. So it wasn't like a huge amounts of money. You know, the union would generate, you know, a few $1 million a month, but it's not as much as you would think.
For the Trader Joe's union, there haven't been any dues implemented yet. They don't have a contract yet. But during the campaign, it was, they said they didn't know what it would be, or it would be democratically chosen upon. But since then, they've changed the tune, and now it'll be democratically chosen upon by a committee. So, and they constantly promised us, oh, it'll be like under $10. And I mean, that was sort of besides the point with this union. We knew this is not a good union for many other reasons.
So we'll tell you what it is after we get the union, basically.
Exactly, like that. And what will this cost? You know, everything was donated support. So there wasn't a lot of real facts to be had by this union. You really just had to hope with this union.
And just going back, you know, I mean, it varies. You know, usually union members will pay local dues, they'll pay state level dues, and then national dues, almost like taxes. And you know, I know in the public sector it varies from $600 to $1,000. You know, especially in the Trader Joe's example, I guess, you know, you guys have pretty solid employee relations, and you don't have maybe as high turnover as some of the other grocery stores like the UFCW, United Food and Commercial Workers Union, has. But, you know, I've heard horror stories of especially kids, you know, summer vacation, getting a job, having to pay an initiation fee plus dues plus all these other things on their first job. And essentially dues eat up almost their entire first paycheck. And they're making minimum wage. And they're going to be there for 2 months during the summer. They don't need benefits. They don't have great representation, but they're forced to pay, especially in non-right-to-work states. So Diane, I don't know if that answers your question. Yes. No.
Hi, I read the Trader Joe's story when it came out, and I was just shocked by it. And I was just curious: was when the organizing started up? Was it a single employee that had come in, and how long had that employee been working there? I mean, I'm asking a question about salting, I guess.
Yes. The people who organized the union were people who had worked there for 10 years or more. So they weren't salts necessarily. I think that some salts might have come into the store months before the campaign was announced. Many people left the store right after the vote was over. Some employees who had been there a while and blatantly said, we want to vote in this union, and then we want to leave. And then a couple other people did leave after that. But the organizers were from within the store.
And if everyone's not familiar, a salt is actually someone who is being paid by a union to take a job to essentially rabble-rouse, as Mike was talking about, at a company. So these are paid union organizers that don't have to disclose they're being paid by the union, except if they're testifying before Congress and they forget to their truth in testimony. That's another story. Happened with Starbucks, but the Starbucks union. But we can talk about that at another time. But essentially, they're paid union organizers. They don't have to disclose. I would argue that labor persuaders or people that inform employees from a company perspective about their rights, they do have to disclose that they're getting paid, and they make disclosures to the Department of Labor. The SALT should do the same, but that's another story.
Yeah, and also with this union, they claim to be a grassroots independent union, but they were definitely being funded by the SEIU and Workers United to start. They've since changed, they claim, but it was definitely an SEIU campaign, and I think that's what makes it very different to how the media presents it as some sort of independent grassroots thing. There was definitely big union involved with this campaign, and that's how it happened.
And before Trader Joe's, you were with Starbucks. And
I was.
I know SEIU has been caught spending millions of dollars on these type of salts to organize Starbucks. So definitely not grassroots.
Yeah, definitely. When we heard about the Starbucks story, so many of my coworkers were like, this is legal? And how is this representative of workers? And it's extremely patronizing, and it tends to be people fresh out of college. So all of that seems really wrong to us, the workers, and I think that needs to be recognized too. That is not representative of workers. And we should know if someone is in our workplace doing that.
Sean, do you have something to add?
Yeah, well, just to clarify a point about salting and why it is an effective tactic is as soon as an employer hires somebody and puts them to work, a lot of federal protections under the National Labor Relations Act and other laws suddenly go into play, and you can't fire somebody for organizing. That's a unfair labor practice. And even if they're doing some particularly egregious activity, and if in the case of SALT, they may have taken the job under false pretenses and never had any intention to seriously work for the company, but they just wanted to essentially to rabble rouse. If you hired him, then that's on you as the employer, and you have to basically put up with them.
Or if they, and once again, we're at Heritage, so we're at a family-friendly organization. I am not going to quote the union-friendly employee, but I'll just say that even if you have a union-friendly employee that curses out in very vulgar, nasty terms another employee, you can't take disciplinary actions against them, as we've seen with one particular Amazon worker and the NLRB going after Amazon for trying to protect their own employees. Rachel?
I have a question for you, Brian. So the union is supposed to represent the workers, and we heard the head of the Teamsters just tell the workers, this is a crappy company, and he literally said, sometimes a bad job just isn't worth it anymore. I've looked at the documents of what was being offered by Yellow to the workers, and I did the math. It was about a $22,000 increase in compensation over 5 years.
Yeah.
Did the workers ever get to see that?
They never got to see it. They were never, information was shared, I don't know, probably about a month prior to the bankruptcy, to the higher ups, what we were posing, because what we heard was that Yellow had a bad contract. It wasn't competitive. We're just like, okay. ABF contract was just negotiated right before that, and the offer we made was comparable in wages to ABF. And back to that point, that message was never communicated to the masses. It was all held close to the vest at the very top. I'm sure, and one of the things that we try to do is we try to get the IBT is to share that information and put it to vote. Let the employees decide if they want to not work at this bad company, as someone said. Let them decide, but they didn't want to do that.
Just want to say thank you for the panel. It's been extremely fascinating. So I was wondering, you talked about how you guys were trying to like change your company at Yellow to make it more operationally efficient.
Yes.
And it sounds like you talked about like something about like you had 1,000 workers, but you wanted like 600 of them to like work at night because that would allow less trips to occur, which obviously allows you to save on cost. And I was wondering, like, the union, I guess, viewed this as a concession. And they felt that if they made this concession, that would make them look bad in the public or bad with their workers or whatnot. Why did they view it as that? Like what about it was a concession? Were these people becoming independent contractors? Like, I'm just a little bit confused on that.
So when we rewrote the change, each of the companies had different work rules, per se. Holland used road drivers to do that work that you just described. Under the National Master Freight Agreement, which, guess what year the National Master Freight Agreement was written? Anybody know? 1967. Think things have changed since 1967 to be competitive in the marketplace? So that language said that we had to do that with a local P&D driver. So there was a difference. So we had the Holland drivers who were going to have to change job classifications to a local P&D, and a lot of those drivers didn't want to do that. So we tried to work with the union to say, okay, if we've got 400 who want to do this, why don't we just let them do what they do, and we'll find 600 more. But they didn't want it. The union did not want to agree with that. They said it was non-contractual, and they didn't fall within the contract, so they weren't going to do it. Even though behind the scenes, they said, that sounds like a plan. We had it worked down to the T, how it was going to work. They changed their opinion at the last minute. I mean, literally, when you have a change like that, it has to go to a change of operations, which all the locals attend, and it's a big, big deal. A week before we were going to go to that hearing, that's when they said, it's off. This is not contractual. We're not going to agree with it, and that stopped. And that was a big deal because at that point, we had all the financing. Everything was done. The banks were willing to give us more money because we were going to eliminate the duplicity. We had the union bought in to what we were going to try to do. We were going to be much more efficient as a company. And that all stopped when they said, no, we're not going to agree with that.
Thank you, Brian. There's a kind of cultural mindset, for lack of a better phrase I can think of, among a lot of union leaders that you just never make any concessions under any circumstances. That anything that you won in a previous collective bargaining session is yours forever. And it's their idea of the slippery slope argument. If you start making a concession on anything, then you start losing other things, and then it goes downhill from there. And so in a lot of cases, they'll just opt for self-destruction rather than making a concession.
Yeah.
I think we have time for, one more question.
Yeah. I was just going to say, so, I mean, we're old and antiquated. We're not modernized. Like I talked to you, we had 20 unionized carriers. Now we're down to 3. Something had to change, right? And that's what we were looking to do. We were going to create a network. We were going to modernize. But we were not asking for concessions. We're actually going to follow the contract to a T. We're going to give more money, okay? But we needed to combine the companies, and that's what couldn't get done. We couldn't bring all the companies as one. That's the thing. There was no concessions.
We have one more question.
One of the most counterproductive aspects of unionization are union work rules that do nothing to improve pay or benefits, but reduce the efficiency and productivity of companies and their employees. I was wondering if the panel could give examples of those kind of counterproductive union work rules, and then also, do you have any ideas about public policies that could address that problem?
Okay, and I will remind the panel that this answer is the only thing that stands between us and tropical smoothie. So I will make one very quick point. At the end of the last panel, we were talking about union wages. At the end of the pandemic, it turns out that non-union wages were actually increasing much faster than unionized wages because of the flexibility that was afforded to non-unionized workers, as opposed to those one-size-fits-all union contracts where everything, including increase in wages, had to be negotiated. So that would be my very quick contribution to not stand between us and tropical smoothie.
I'll make the first comment. So just look at yellow. The big deal there was any non-union company, as they see fit, they need to change their operation, they can change on a dime. I had to go talk to all the different locals. I had to get everybody's buy-in. I had to have a big hearing. You know, they can make decisions in months. This takes a year.
I'll say as a reporter, I've often encountered unions saying quite the opposite, that, well, if workforce is unionized, it's actually more productive and does more because they'll argue the workers are happier. I don't know that necessarily balances out that way, but that's the argument that you often hear and the sort of mindset that you're trying to confront in these situations.
Michael, do you think the Trader Joe's workers were happier when the unions were trying to organize you?
We're certainly not happier when the union was trying to organize us. It definitely took our positive workplace and just turned it into a us against them environment. And they don't have a contract yet, but the union that's representing me at the bargaining table, because I live in Massachusetts, I did go to a bargaining session once, and the sorts of proposals I saw, one proposal in particular, which to talk about productivity, was some provisions to give people like up to 3 months paid time off of work, and you can do an extra 3 unpaid, so like 6 months out of work for the year, and you still accrue the hours that'll go towards your benefits. So you're still accruing all your benefits for those 6 months you're not working, and this would be available to brand new employees. And that was one of the proposals I saw in bargaining.
Well, with that cheery note, we are at time. So thank you to the panel. You guys were fantastic. Appreciate hearing what was on the front lines.